What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 games or IPs that I would love to see get a remaster or a remake. Now, there is technically a difference between a remake and a remaster, but I'd love to see these games get either or, frankly, as I think those are great options for bringing a game to a new audience that just might not otherwise want to play an older title that for various reasons might be clunky or just a giant pain to play in general. And at the same time, this does sort of help with games preservation. And then the last thing I want to mention before we actually dive into the video is that in many of these cases, it is absolutely just wishful thinking on my part. I fully admit that. I don't really expect any of these to see a remake or a remaster. I just think it would be really cool if they did. And on that note, I figured we'd start this list with the game I think a lot of people who watch this channel would agree with, and that is Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura. This is a game from Troika, a now defunct company that made 3 amazing cult classics. And while some of them found their place later in life, if you will, like Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, Arcanum unfortunately hasn't seen quite as much of that longevity. However, it did see a lot of love through an equally impressive fan-made patch that has kept the game alive in many ways, and much like Bloodlines, I really wouldn't recommend even trying this game without that patch. All of that to tell you, Arcanum is simultaneously a fantastic and deeply flawed game. The combat system is not great. The character progression is a real mess. There's just menus for days. None of it is cohesive. There's just so many things that could have been done better. And yet, somehow, Arcanum, with its blending of sort of steampunk and, of course, Magic Obscura, along with the writing and storytelling, really manages to paint a beautifully unique world that I think had so much potential and unfortunately never really got to go anywhere. Now, these days, the IP is held by Activision, actually, which, soon should be owned by Microsoft, so theoretically, we might see something with this. However, given the relatively tame audience for this game, the chances of them doing anything with this IP, even once Microsoft owns it, is still pretty low. But somehow, still more possible than when just Activision owned it. And that brings us to our second title on this list, and it is actually Divine Divinity, the original game in the Divinity series, which eventually spawned Divinity Original Sin 2. However, Divine Divinity, the first game, which launched all the way back in 2002, was surprisingly ahead of its time. I mentioned in a video recently, actually, that this is a game that, as soon as you played it, you knew they were sitting on a gold mine. It was almost a sort of open-world Diablo-like that had actual choice and consequence within its RPG elements. And honestly, to this day, I can say that I've never played anything quite like Divine Divinity, and it truly is a remarkable game. However, like a lot of games on this list, it's very hard to play it nowadays. It does not like modern hardware at all. It took me several hours just to get this running to play the story and everything for the story videos and stuff when I covered a bunch of Divinity lore. It was a nightmare dealing with this thing, and that doesn't even start to account for the game-breaking bugs that require a hex editor to fix. And yet, in spite of those things, it is a really, really great game. And I would love to see this get a remaster, just to sort of bring it up to par with modern hardware, fix some of the prevalent bugs that have been very well known for a very long time. Because honestly, I think this game would do well even in this day and age. But that, of course, brings us to number 3 on our list, and it is none other than Jade Empire. I played through Jade Empire for the first time earlier this year, and I loved it, actually. In fact, really the biggest problem with Jade Empire, like a lot of these games, is that in some cases it just doesn't like modern hardware, especially the Steam distribution. A lot of this isn't as much of a problem with the GOG version, but this is another game that could really just do with a fresh coat of paint and get it up and running on modern hardware without a bunch of input on the user end. Because the second you have to start instructing people to go through files, they tend to get a little uncomfortable by and large. But Jade Empire is an interesting case because it is from BioWare, as a lot of people I'm sure know, but it kind of marks the shift from sort of proper RPG mechanics, if you will, into a more action-oriented system. Because while Jade Empire uses a lot of the same stuff that was used to make KOTOR and whatnot, they kind of gutted a lot of the more RPG choices in favor of a more action-oriented game. And in some ways, I think it worked out. I think they did a lot with a little, and it is a very memorable experience. But it's definitely one of those first moments from BioWare where you're like, wow, this is decidedly different from what you'd done up to this point. And nonetheless, though, it has a really cool story that I liked a lot. Combine that with all these sort of martial arts styles you can pick up and learn over the course of the game, some of the choices you can make, and it's a really cool experience that I think more people should be able to enjoy. And that brings us to number 4 on our list with the second BioWare entry on this title, and that is actually Dragon Age Origins. Now, I don't know if they'll bother to remaster this one. On one hand, they did the Mass Effect trilogy, sure, but the Dragon Age series as a whole has a much more recent entry with Dragon Age Inquisition, but even that's getting kind of old. But that said, I would actually love to see Dragon Age Origins get a fresh coat of paint again. And this is mostly just to make it a little more playable. Because while Dragon Age Origins is a great game and has a lot of hallmarks of what you would expect from an RPG, especially when it was made, it nonetheless has some persistent technical issues, and I'm fully aware that some people will tell you all about how they can run it just fine and there's no issues. The slightest bit of Google searching will tell you that Dragon Age Origins gives a lot of people a very hard time, and I think a remaster, if nothing else, just to fix those parts of it, as well as some of the very prominent bugs that have hung around since then, would really go a long way. Now, on the flip side of that, I think Dragon Age Origins, with as beloved as it is, might be a difficult game to apply a remaster to, as I think some people really don't trust BioWare to touch it at this point, and at the same time, I think there's an argument to be made that changing too much of Dragon Age Origins might fundamentally alter the experience in some way. But regardless, Dragon Age Origins is a fantastic title, and while honestly, I'm on the record as saying this before, I don't love it quite as much as a lot of other people do, it's nonetheless a cool game that I would love to see be made more playable. And that brings us to number 5 on this list, which is quite the deep cut, but I have actually covered it on the channel before, and that is Lionheart: Legacy of the Crusader. This is an interesting one, really, as it is sort of the final isometric CRPG that was released before there was just sort of a dead period for about 10 years, and we kind of saw their resurgence in the early 2010s. Because Lionheart was the very last game published by Black Isle Studios before they shuttered their doors. And as such, it was actually kind of rushed out the door, which only led to further problems. Now, people didn't like Lionheart for a lot of reasons, and I would say it primarily comes down to 2 things. One, the game failed to save Black Isle Studios. That was a very much loved developer and publisher, and a lot of people just knew Lionheart wasn't going to save that company, and there was kind of backlash about it in that regard. And then the second thing is that, unfortunately, the game just wasn't finished. It had to be rushed out the door, and the back half of the game is just an entirely different experience from the first part of the game. However, the first part of the game is honestly something special. They were on to something. If this game had seen its full development time and been released in the state they wanted to release it in, I think it truly could have been a special game that people really remembered as a pillar of what CRPGs are. The game itself actually takes place in a sort of alternate reality where the real-world Crusades actually saw a tear in the fabric of reality that brought in the supernatural, and this has since, of course, given us things like magic, etc., but it kind of shapes the political happenings of the time, so the Inquisition becomes this sort of like actual witch hunting organization as opposed to a pretend witch hunting organization. But the game played with so many cool ideas. It actually just straight up took Fallout's special system and used it as its own, by the way, so if you ever want to try this game out and you've played Fallout 1 or 2, you'll actually be fairly familiar with the character creator. But you take this character that you make who has a sort of bound spirit which gives them access to magic, and you at first put them through their paces in Barcelona, where you can make a ton of different decisions, side with different factions or the other, and then you move on from Barcelona to one more smaller town where you can again kind of mess around with some choices and consequences, and then unfortunately everything after that point really just falls apart. The game takes a bit of a nosedive and becomes a giant dungeon slog, which most people can't be bothered to finish. And it's one of those games where I think if they just remastered it and or just remade it and really finished that in piece, I think they would really have something special going on. However, truth be told, I'm not even sure who owns the IP to this one at this point. It's a little hard to track this one down. But nonetheless, playing through Lionheart, while it has this sort of weird legacy in gaming history, I really do feel like if they finished this game and sort of remastered or remade it and re-released it, I think it would be well received. And furthermore, there's my opinion on 5 games I'd love to see a remaster or a remake for, so hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.